Okay.
Hi, I'm Eddie McAndrew, COO of AIS Network.
And I'm Warren Dillon, the Principal Cybersecurity Engineer for AIS Network.
And we're going to be talking to you today about investigating and preventing cyber attacks. But a key thread that will run through the presentation is an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So key elements of the presentation today include, hey, wait, is it investigate and prevent, or is it prevent and investigate? Governance versus cyber projects versus operations. First step in prevention, a security program. Governance, projects, operations, and using the structure, this structure for investigations. And of course, questions will come at the end. So, hey, wait, is it investigate and prevent or prevent and investigate? You know, putting the tools in place before an incident occurs, really it reduces the risk of an incident, but also it really provides the underpinnings of what makes an investigation effective when an incident does occur.
Yes, absolutely. If you have, you have a lot of information to pull together in an investigation. If you have all the pieces in place beforehand, if you have the program properly implemented, it makes life a lot easier when you do have to investigate.
So the key elements in preparation include developing a security program, implementing security controls, and then maintaining those security controls for your security with your security operations. Security controls really provide what's needed to investigate an incident.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Let's dive right in.
Okay, so just to kind of set the stage, I like to view the continuum of cybersecurity across three areas: governance, cybersecurity projects, and then operations. So governance, really, it's like assign people, policies, and procedures, and then the structure of the security controls. Now, security projects, they're like implementing the policies and procedures, assessing the effectiveness, updating, and we'll go into a little bit of detail in each of these areas. And then operations, that's regular, repeated activities that are really necessary to drive a sound security posture, including things like vulnerability scanning, pen testing, auditing, those types of things. So the first step in preventing a security incident is a security program. And the fundamental elements of a security program really revolve around, like as so many technology projects do, people, process, and technology. An assigned individual that's responsible for the security program. And, in a lot of cases, that might be someone who has a part-time role, but it might be in a large organization, somebody whose primary job, and I know I'm probably speaking to a lot of CISOs out there today, who's responsible for that program, ensuring who's going to do it, people, the roles and responsibility, people know what they need to do, they're trained, the processes that are required to execute the controls, put the policies in place, and procedures that allow the people to know what to do. Talk a little bit about the technology involved in a security program.
So for technology, of course, you're going to have everything from your perimeter defenses, your firewalls, your intrusion detection sensors, all the way through to the host, the network devices in between, your switches, your routers. All of those play a part in, of course, the security posture, because they all have secure or more secure or less secure configurations. So then you do some implementation on your host, you have data protections and other configurations, and you have security specific devices that are monitoring the network, that are capturing log files, that are doing analysis on those log files. So there's a variety of pieces. But one of the best analogies I've read about and kind of involved myself in is the idea, if you think about it from the way you deal with fire safety in your home, right? Everybody has a smoke detector in their house. Most, a lot of people even have fire extinguishers in the house, but do you have the process on how to use those? Does your family know, who does what in the event that smoke alarm goes off? Who gets the dog out? Who takes care of making sure the kids are out of the house or whatever? There's a people component there and there's a process component there. And also for things like testing the batteries in the smoke detector, checking to make sure the fire extinguisher is charged. Those are all part of the process. So it's a larger thing than just the technology.
Okay. So talk a little bit, we did that project in Miami, and the first component of that was putting together a security architecture.
Yeah.
So talk to me about the process that you used, that we used collectively to develop and implement that security architecture.
So we laid out, we used the SOTSA model for security architecture, and that starts at a high conceptual level. What are the business drivers that you're trying to achieve? And then it goes deeper at each layer. It's like 7 layers, I believe, if I recall correctly. And each layer goes deeper and deeper until on the final layer, you're down to the details of very specific. We're going to put this tool in this place and we're going to implement it this way. So you really boil down from the business driver down through the concept, down through the contextual information, down to the specifics.
So you model the business process.
Exactly.
Identify elements that will align with the security posture, and then apply tools in terms of technology to actually effectively drive that control and then configure the controls at a detailed level.
Exactly.
So that really pulls together, the components from a process, procedure, and implementation of a security architecture. Okay, so let's talk about governance. Okay. So governance, security governance is really derived from the strategic planning process, where you identify the people, the elements in terms of architecture, and then the policies and procedures that are used to implement that. So looking at an organizational structure, again, with an identified individual, team member roles, responsibility, the architecture typically with the design, the defense in depth design. So talk to me about the defense in depth design a little bit.
So defense in depth is the idea that you put in defenses at various levels so that where one might have a hole or a gap, others will kind of mitigate that or correct it. So for example, you'll go from the outside in, you'll have a perimeter firewall. You'll come in and do network security on your switches using possibly an IDS, intrusion detection or prevention, and other network security components, network segmentation, that sort of thing, access lists, and so on. Then you'll get to the host level and you'll do host level protections, host firewall, host-based security, then down to the application level where you'll make sure that the application is configured in a way that's secure. And then finally, you'll secure the data itself, database protections, encryption, that sort of thing.
Okay, so we're going level by level, external DMZ into the firewall, into the organization on the network, and then to the system, and then to the application, and then each of those provide a layer of defense. Now, so why are we going into this, element of security? And when we're talking about investigating cyber attacks, we'll get into that later, but each of these items provide a point at which we can identify, track, and hopefully determine the vector of attack and really begin to understand how it happened, when it happened. And again, the policies and procedures are critical to understanding how the architecture is set up and how it's maintained and how information might be captured. Okay, security projects. Now, it may sound a little simple, but definition of a project: a defined start date and an end date with identified scope, and then clearly defined end state, deliverables or outcomes. Now, this is critical within a security posture of an organization, because it allows you to take the governance, implement the program, and then establish the rhythm of the operations. And by looking at elements like, developing a security architecture or implementing security controls or remedial actions related to, correcting identified vulnerabilities as a project, you're able to, compartmentalize those and bound those and understand what the level of effort associated with each of those projects is, so that you can really, as you move forward, understand what's necessary to maintain the organization in terms of projects and level of efforts, and start and end date in a structured approach working through the project. It differs from operational in that they're a specific instance in time with a start and end date. So give me some examples of security projects.
So one thing to build on what you were just saying, if you say something like, I want to improve our vulnerability management program, that's not a project. That's a goal, it's a nice idea. A project would be, we're going to implement vulnerability scanning and then patch management and then this, and we're going to do it in this order and a specific set of steps so that we can, and it might break down into smaller projects in this case. But a project, to your point, would be something like, we're going to implement a log aggregation system. And
so there's a defined activity.
A defined activity. We're going to set up this system to capture logs from all the devices. There's a phase where we identify what logs we're sending. We configure the devices to send them, and then the device starts to receive them. We test, we make sure we're getting everything we expected. So you've got a nice clear-cut, laid out step-by-step process there.
With defined outcomes.
Exactly.
And, really, the point here is that they're really key to maintaining a sound security posture, and understanding it as a project allows you to estimate the level of effort, define the end state, and set up the steps that are necessary to actually execute. Okay, Oren, talk to me about security operations.
So operations is all about process. Processes are specific tasks that you do on a regular basis, and you need to be able to do them consistently every time, so that you're getting consistent results, so you can compare month over month, year over year, week over week, whatever may be appropriate for your environment. So processes are tasks. They're not defined as a project because they're recurring in that sense. The operations processes ensure that the tools and the architecture that you've put in place are actually working, that they're continuing to protect your organization over time, that they're continuing to improve the organization's security posture, and to identify and remediate vulnerabilities as they come up. So that's why vulnerability scanning is a great example of a process, operations process. You're going to do it every month or as often as you feel you need to, and look at those results and say, okay, how am I making progress on resolving vulnerabilities that were found 3 months ago? And how am I looking as far as new vulnerabilities that are coming out?
So like a key differentiation is operations are cyclical in nature.
Yes.
They're repeated, and they're required to maintain a sound security posture, and they occur at regular repeated intervals. Now, what about something like, security awareness? You do it once at the beginning of the year and then it's done, or?
So security awareness is an interesting one, because you can do parts of it, like the annual training, as almost it's sort of like a project, because it happens once a year. It has a defined start, end, all that. But security awareness goes beyond that. That needs to be a multi-threaded, kind of multi-pronged process, if you will, of getting security to the forefront of people's minds, so that they can effectively deter problems.
Right. So, it's interesting. Security awareness is so critical, because the largest effector of attacks the person in the seat, right? And so driving a culture of security awareness throughout the organization is a critical component as well. Now, one of the things that occurs to me is you're like, hey, it's sort of like a project. And so when you think about governance versus projects versus operations, it sounds like they kind of bleed into each other. And in many instances, there isn't really a clearly defined boundary between them?
There's definitely a lot of overlap. As we said, in the operations process, there's a lot of tasks. And of course, a task has a start and end and a specific thing you're trying to get to, but it doesn't have the broader scope that a project tends to have. So there is a lot of overlap and there's a lot of cycle in the process because you don't just go and implement your security program once and leave it. You come back and you assess how it's doing, and then you put together projects to make changes, and then you operationalize those processes so that then you can come back and do it again and keep refining and keep improving.
Okay, so here's some examples. Talk us through some of these examples of security operations activities.
Okay, there are a whole page full here. Asset discovery and management. One of the key things that a lot of agencies and companies miss out on is that they have all these technology in place to look at things, but they don't know how many devices they actually have in their environment and don't know where they are.
Well, I mean, you're familiar with Center for Internet Security, right? CIS.
Yes.
So CIS top 20 asset management is number one, right? You can't secure something if you don't know where it is. A lot of people don't really think of it necessarily as a security activity.
Right. A lot of companies end up using asset management as more of like an accounting function, right? Keeping track of the hardware you have deployed or whatever.
Sure.
And it has that aspect, but it's from security perspective, you use it to know where the authorized devices are in your environment, whether or not there are unauthorized devices in your environment, and all those sorts.
Well, how does that, align with or dovetail into configuration compliance, configuration management?
So configuration compliance assessment or configuration management as a larger program is having documented standards so that you define your systems, you build your servers and your laptops and whatever to certain specifications that are based on standards. To Eddie's point, the CIS, Center for Internet Standards, has a whole series of benchmarks that you can look at as an example. There are different standards across different frameworks, but you can configure devices to those, and you can say, I configure this device to this standard. And configuration compliance assessment is a way of checking to see how closely your machines are defined to that standard.
Okay, so we got asset discovery and management, right? We know what the assets are. We have configuration compliance, right? Okay, so we know what they are, we know how they're configured, along with a documented baseline that establishes, a secure standard at the level that it should be, right?
Right.
Oh, okay, so we know what it is, we know how it's configured. What about file integrity monitoring?
So one of the things dovetailing the two in is when you've got that configuration baseline, you know how the device was configured when it was put into service. What if it changes? Right. You need to capture those changes. File integrity monitoring is one way to look at that.
Okay.
It's looking at the critical system files on the device to see if a file has changed, and it will notify you. And you can look at it and say, okay, yeah, I did patching on that machine last night. I would expect this, and this to be changed. Or hold up, something has changed and I don't know why.
Okay.
Which could then tip you off to a problem.
Right. So we're walking through security operations and then vulnerability scanning. It sounds like it could assist with this process of looking at the configurations, the file integrity monitoring, and then what else does that do for you relative, in terms of security?
So vulnerability scanning comes in a couple of flavors, the web application scanning and also internal scanning of the server. Both are really looking for essentially the same kinds of things. They're looking for either vulnerable software versions, where the software you're running has a published vulnerability that could be exploited possibly, or a vulnerable configuration, where in the case of a web app, it might not be doing input validation. So now you're subject to potentially some kind of injection attack. If your SSL configuration isn't what it should be, isn't as secure as it could be, you could be subject to attacks based on that. So the vulnerability scanning is going to look at a combination of what it sees application-wise from the outside, but also if you do credential scanning, you can log into the machine and actually run a bunch of registry checks and configuration settings, and it will pop up issues that may be vulnerabilities.
So it's looking for specific items in terms of patches, configuration, up-to-date software, and
Right.
giving you a picture of a point in time of what you have in your environment.
Absolutely. It is definitely, number one, it is a point in time. Number two, to your point, it is a series of specific tests. So if a 0-day vulnerability is out there and the scanner doesn't know to look for it, obviously it's not going to find it.
0 day, that means it just happened like that day.
That means the vendor of the software doesn't know about it yet, or has just found out about it.
Right.
So it's newly released or newly announced.
Okay, so talk to me about, log reviews, analysis, and how that fits into the security operations.
So you want to be, of course, looking back to your information security standards as far as what kind of information you're logging. You want to make sure you're logging the right things. And you want to log that from a variety of things across the network, not just the server or the application, but the server, the application, the network gear, the firewalls, security devices like IDSs. Basically, all of these devices should be logging into or sending their logs to a aggregator that collects all the logs. And then, so you're getting all that into a single repository, which gives you a broader view across the environment. You're not just seeing the small picture.
So now you're looking at it not just as a point in time, but as a collection of information and occurrences over a period of time.
Exactly. You can look at logs across, if you're logging all this information, you have a history, you can see trends, you can see usage patterns and things like that.
Okay. So yeah, I mean, that almost leads into the idea. So we talk about defense in depth, right? As opposed to behavioral and even, advanced activities based on identifying anomalous behavior of the network and of your environment.
Right. I mean, in the more advanced user behavior and analytics type systems, you get into things like, I know that Bob logs onto his machine at 9 a.m. from Richmond, Virginia, every weekday, and he logs off at 5. And all of a sudden, the network sees Bob logging in from China at 3 in the morning. Something's wrong.
Did Bob go to China?
I mean, it's possible
no.
Bob made a trip to China,
China.
but it's much more likely that someone's gotten his credentials somehow and is hacking in.
Right.
So
and it also could be like performance or variations on within your environment, either through IP pings or bandwidth. So like off hours time in the middle of the night, all of a sudden you have this huge peak that's unexplainable.
There's a data transfer peak that doesn't normally happen. There would be something worth investigating to figure out what it is and why. It might be above board, but then again, it might not be.
So that sounds like some pretty advanced usage of log aggregation and analysis, and using your system information event management system to really, your SIM to really drive capability in the organization.
Right. And given the size of log files and the amount of information in them, any one device on your network can generate hundreds or thousands of pages of information.
Wow.
So obviously a human sitting here going through all that is going to be
painful
and slow and
not very effective.
Not extremely effective.
So
a SIM weeds out the noise. It's automated and it recognizes those patterns over time. It learns how your network functions and it starts to point out the things and bubble them up to for your attention and your investigation.
It sounds like it could be relatively complex to implement your SIM and configure it in a manner that would really provide that information. You think so?
In getting it started is making sure you're logging the right information and it's pointing to the SIM is looking at all of that. And then a lot of the learning these days is actually kind of automated. It's a machine learning kind of model.
Cool.
On the more advanced products, so that it begins to learn over time. It learns your network. It learns how the data flows. And
setting the thresholds for activities with some automated capture of the information that will help to define what those thresholds might be.
Absolutely, and there is a fair amount of time spent in that initial configuration step.
Okay.
But once you get there, it's extremely helpful.
So penetration testing, can you talk about that and compare and contrast to vulnerability scanning and how one might facilitate the other?
So vulnerability scanning is looking at what might be vulnerable, right? Looking at you're running this version of this particular software package and we know that it had a published vulnerability. you might be vulnerable to that. Then again, the configuration of your system may not be. The scanner doesn't necessarily go and try to test for the vulnerability. It just looks at versions and it looks at obvious indicators.
Okay, so pen testing.
Now, pen testing gets into the details. Pen testing actually is someone trying to exploit a vulnerability to see if they can crack into your system or if they can exfiltrate data or whatever the particular vulnerability has to do. Pen testing at a broader level checks the various layers of that layered defense model we were talking about earlier. So the first step in a broader pen test would be to try to get through the firewall, get through the perimeter. Can I get into the network? Can I get into a server? Can I get the sensitive data? And you're just kind of drilling in through those layers and trying to find your way through to get to that.
Okay, talk about white box, gray box, black box, how vulnerability scanning may be a tool for.
Okay, so vulnerability scanning is a beginning step in a pen test. You're going to do some kind of either port scanning, vulnerability scanning, or some combination of both, so that you identify potential vulnerabilities that should help you narrow down what you want to try to exploit. The white box, black box, gray box bit is a question of how much information the pen tester has about the network or about the application. A black box test is pretty much, here's the URL, go. Within a reasonable scope, but very little information provided. We're not going to tell you what it's running on. We're not going to tell you how it's configured or anything else. Gray box would be a little more information. It's kind of opening the box a little bit and saying, okay, we're running these plugins on WordPress, and other than that, we're not telling you anything else. For example, a white box or crystal box test is literally all the details are available. All the necessary detail is available to the pen tester so that then they can refine what they're testing to take the best advantage of that. They don't burn time and energy just kind of figuring things out and doing all the reconnaissance. They've got all the reconnaissance and they can now plan the attacks more effectively.
Okay. And then auditing, right? Having somebody look at your system for specific evidence that relates to, demonstrating particular required controls are in place, right?
Exactly.
Okay, so all these things look like they're going to really provide some preventive capability and capture information. So, okay, so let's say something happens, right? There we go. So I shouldn't touch that. So if something happens, you got to respond, right? So it's critical part of the both your governance and then implementation would be a project, but then with operations, you really need to have an incident response and breach notification process.
Yes. Mm-hmm. So incident response has to really hit the fundamental steps. Of course, preparing. We're talking about prevention, an ounce of prevention being worth a pound of cure.
Right.
Being able to prepare for the event ahead of time. Detecting the event.
Right.
The steps we've been talking about will help you detect things earlier, faster. Containing and recovering is limiting the damage and then getting the systems back online.
Right. So you identify, you have a plan. Right? You've got these controls in place. You detect the incident, then you isolate and contain the incident. Yes. Right? Pull it offline. Maybe
you may segment it, firewall it off so it can't touch anything else on the network. You may shut the machine down. There's a number of possible containment methods.
So it sounds like that whole asset management piece would really facilitate identifying which devices you have, which ones might have been compromised, and the process that would be used to isolate and then recover, hopefully, right?
Absolutely. Yes, asset management is going to be key to that, to knowing what could have been affected, what is affected, and then doing the recovery, making sure you clean everything up and that everything's back on track.
Okay, then what about this after action review or report or what?
After you recover from an incident, you're going to do as part of it, and part of what we're talking about today is the investigation of the incident. So where it happened, how it happened, and all those things. We'll get to those a little bit later. But as you pull all that information together, you're going to produce a report of what happened, what was the incident, how did it occur, and so on. And then you're going to review how you did the investigation, where are there gaps in security, and other things of that nature, so that you can do kind of a lessons learned thing and make the program better. Either
Right.
improve the incident response itself.
Across the board, all those controls we talked about, and then your incident response process.
Right, it covers both.
Right.
So you do, yeah, the controls as well as the process itself.
Okay, then breach notifications, right? You gotta let people know, tell everybody everything all at once, right?
No. Of course, yeah, this is where the people part and the process part of the roles and responsibilities in your program come into play. As you're doing your investigation, a lot of times you're going to find that you thought it was over here, but the cause is really something over there. It goes off in a different
So
direction
when you're
from
doing
what
the
you expected.
investigation, you're actually seeing, maybe you thought you knew, but then you see some more evidence and it changes what the vector of attack might have been.
Absolutely, absolutely. So you don't want to announce too broadly, too much information until you have more facts and more of a conclusion.
So it sounds like the communication control, structure, process, identified roles within that communication process is critical, right?
Absolutely.
Your technical elements, your outward facing to whether it be to the media or to the chain, up to through your secretariat and in general, you need to have a very well-defined communication process that includes the identified individuals and then the specific elements of that message and how they will be communicated from a technical, from an organizational, from a business management standpoint.
Absolutely, because to your point, you're including the public, the media, senior management, as well as possibly law enforcement. So you need to make sure that all of that gets done in a very planned and structured manner.
Right. You go.
I'll do it.
Okay, Oren, so we spent all this time talking about preparation. Talk about, the using this structure and this security preparation for the investigation.
Okay, so as we've alluded to along the way, and it's in any incident investigation, the key is gathering the information. You need to know how many devices are affected, which devices are affected. Can you trace back to how the initial exploit occurred? How did the attacker get into the network? For example, if you have, say, a ransomware attack, right? Which devices, to a certain degree, it's which devices are encrypted, but there may be traces on other machines that didn't fully encrypt. But that doesn't necessarily tell you how the bug got in the first place. So you'd have to trace back a little further and go back to how they got into the network.
So you could actually think you know where it is and you don't.
Exactly. Did somebody open an email that they weren't supposed to? Did somebody hit an RDP port that wasn't protected? It could be a number of things. So how did the initial exploit occur? What was that vector of attack and infection? And then how did the attacker escalate privilege, assuming that they did? How did they move across the network? And the biggest question for most agencies and most businesses really, was any sensitive data exposed to the public, exfiltrated, deleted, or corrupted? You need to know what happened to the data so that you know how to recover and get back to operational.
Okay,
space.
so what was affected? When was it affected? The vector of attack or how it came, and then the process, the sequence of events that occurred post initiation in terms of either escalation or encryption, and then the data impact ultimately, corrupted, exfiltrated, just used, right, or even modified, right, for the integrity of the data being impacted. Okay,
so that's a lot of information. So to our point from the beginning, right, an ounce of prevention equals a pound of cure at least. Having your processes operationalized means you spend less time scrambling around trying to find the answers. If you have an asset management process, it's going to help you know what got impacted. And if you have rogue devices on your network, if somebody managed to get into your physical data center and plug in something that wasn't supposed to be there.
So a device that's not in your inventory, your asset management system, it can be easily identified or more easily.
More easily, yes. And at the very minimum, an asset management process is going to help you determine the scope of the impact of the infection.
Okay, what about logs?
Well, file integrity monitoring Touch on that. It narrows down the systems. That helps you also narrow down which systems were affected because you'll see which critical files were impacted.
Right.
Now, logging, to the point we were talking about earlier, if you're tracing back through how something was attacked, where the initial vector, where it came in, the time span, and how the whole process laid out, you really need that aggregated log source. One of the first things an attacker, well, not first things really, but one of the key things an attacker will do to cover their tracks is as they do things on the system, they'll go back and either delete the log files or they'll modify the log files, introduce a lot of noise in an effort to hide their presence.
Okay.
Or
So
to keep you from being able
some
to trace.
means of protecting those logs, some layered approach, or would be helpful in terms of preventing that.
Right, and that's where an aggregated log source comes into play. You send your logs from the systems they occur on to an aggregator, and it's designed in such a way that I can send new logs, but I don't go, if I delete logs on the host, it doesn't go back and delete them on the log aggregator. It secures those logs for future analysis. So the log source retains the logs, and then you get the SIM to do the analysis so that it can not only, in some cases, see things as they're happening, but it can at least help you go back and correlate what did happen. You can start at a certain point and you can follow the trail, and it will help you weed through the noise, the garbage, and kind of the mundane stuff, and find the key things that are part of that chain of events.
Okay, what about, you mentioned a little while ago, forensics activities associated with pulling systems off the network, and what are some of the tools, what are some of the techniques that are used for that?
So there are a number of possibilities. If a individual machine is affected and you want to do forensic analysis on it, you can do memory analysis, you can do disk analysis, and there's variables back and forth as to whether you take it off the network entirely or not, do you shut it down or not, because each has pluses and minuses. If you power the machine off, it definitely isn't going to connect to anything else, but you lose whatever was running in memory.
Right. Okay.
If you take it off the network and it's beaconing out to some kind of command and control device, and it stops beaconing and then takes other action because of that. The more advanced persistent threats can do that. They're set up that way. So you have to kind of weigh the options and decide what the best forensic approach is to try to collect the evidence from the machine itself that you can then use for your investigation or potentially for prosecution if it comes to that. If you can identify the perpetrator.
So if you don't have asset management, you don't have the logs.
You don't have asset management, you don't have the logs, you don't have something to help you go through the logs, you're probably going to have a hard time getting to these answers.
Right. So talk about what? So system logs, network log, firewall. What are we? Let's talk about a couple of the logs.
So yeah, network logs, so firewalls, routers, switches,
IDS,
IPS can send their logs. If you have data loss prevention services, you can have that logging into your system. That will identify data being pulled off of machines and that kind of thing, unusual transfers. Server logs, so operating system logs, application logs. And if you have agents that run on the machine, so if you have an antivirus that runs some sort of an agent, it will collect information about what's going on. You can report that. Any number of
so
there's a wide
range. So that really the aggregation and the SIM and the ability to slice, dice, analyze, pull together from that makes sense.
Correlate across different platforms.
Okay. All right.
And of course, detection is preferable to investigation. It's much better to detect the activity before you still probably end up doing some investigation, but you want to detect and catch malicious activity before it gets widespread on your network.
Or at the earliest possible point, right?
Exactly.
It seems like so many of these exploits, hacks that I've seen go some period of time before they're even detected.
Mm-hmm. I don't recall the exact statistic, but there's statistics on how long the attacker was in the network before.
And it's months, if not years,
and
right?
in some cases, it's months, even years. Exactly. One client we dealt with that had a ransomware attack, the ransomware got in and it was a couple of days before anything kicked off. They had gotten in and boom, it started encrypting machines on a certain day at a certain time. and their systems weren't, they didn't have enough detection in place to really catch that.
Right.
So we ended up doing the backtracking and trying to figure out how.
Okay, so, and then vulnerability scanning and remediation reduces the surface, attack surface, right?
Absolutely. It helps you to tighten up the attack surface so there's not as much exposed.
Right.
And then finally, penetration testing will, of course, test the defenses from the attacker's point of view. And see it from the outside, the pen tester is going to try to use or abuse the system in a way that it wasn't intended to work to get to what they want to get to. And that's part of it too. If you're just testing what you know you should be looking for, you might be missing an angle.
Okay, so we're just about done here. I think there's a little bit of time for questions if there are some. So basically, just to recap, the key is preparation, both in terms of your security program and the governance and the controls, and then maintaining the program. It's like, you put locks on your house, but if you don't lock them when you leave or at night, what good do they do, right?
And if you only lock them once.
Lock them once, never leave, never come back. No, but incident response and breach notification, prepare, detect, contain, and recover, right? So all these things work together. And the investigation is really a culmination of having the tools, using the tools, and then being prepared to respond and protect and identify and help, figure out what happened.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we have a few minutes for questions, and I don't know if any came in.
I haven't seen any come in yet, but we'll give it a couple minutes and see what we get.
All right.
We must have hit all the key points.
Either that or everyone's just getting started with the first section.
So, Madeline, is this the very first session in the conference?
This is the first breakout session of the day, yes.
Okay.
This is my first session of the day.
And ours as well.
Ours first and last. But we'll be watching the other ones, don't worry. Well, I think that gave him enough time. Again, I'm Eddie McAndrew, COO at AIS Network.
And I'm Warren Dillon. I'm the principal cybersecurity engineer for AIS Network.
And if you think of a question later, or you'd like to get additional information on any of these topics, by all means, feel free to reach out. We'd be happy to talk to you.
Absolutely.
Well, that sounds good. Thank you so much to Eddie and Oren, and a reminder to everybody else, we're taking a quick break, and then we're getting set up for our next breakout. We'll see you soon.
Thanks.
All right, thank you.